Hi, my name's Tom Schreck, and I'm a judge with the New York State Athletic Commission. I've been judging for about 16 years, and depending on how you count them, I've judged about 20 world title bouts with boxers like Miguel Cotto, Danny Garcia, Zab Judah, James Toney, Andre Berto, Manny Pacquiao, Marco Antonio Barrera, Erik Morales, and some others. I'm very proud to be a judge in New York State, and in September of 2012, I was asked to lead the annual training for judges. And I wanted to take the training in a different direction than a lot of the trainings that I've been to, all of which, by the way, I thought were excellent. Generally speaking, a seminar for judges talks about rules, talks about how to score a round, talks about unusual rounds, and talks about things like keeping a mental computer, thanks to Judge Tommy Kazmarek, and keeping track of whether the round is close or dominant or even. I wanted to go in a different direction with my training, and I titled the training Scoring the Close Rounds, Developing a Strategic Framework for Assessment. My goal with the training is to look beyond the criteria and into the mechanisms and into the science of punches, the science of movement, the science of body mechanics, and the science that makes up a good boxing defense. So this training, I hope you will find, will be a little bit different, and we're going to focus on some things that we generally don't focus on, things like body mechanics and physics and movement and how the body works. And the reason for that is not to try to sound smart, but to break down what goes into a forceful punch, what goes into an effective strike, what is good defense, what is good ring generalship. Not based on a subjective definition, but based on body mechanics. I want, at the end of this training, for you to be able to look at the fights that I've selected, look at the styles of the fighters, and be able to employ a strategic framework for assessing who's doing more damage in the bout. And let's talk about doing damage. In professional boxing, damage is the key. That may not be polite, that might not be politically correct in today's world, but we're looking at who wreaks more damage on their opponent. It's not fencing, it's not amateur boxing, it's not a taekwondo tournament. It's about landing forceful punches and, in effect, exacting a toll on one's opponent. So, professional boxing is all about doing damage. And the points, and I have that in quotes, the points that we score have to do with the assessment of how much we find particular strikes and punches damaging. And our official scoring criteria, clean punching, effective aggressiveness, ring generalship, and defense, are all about damaging, setting yourself up to do damage, or preventing damage. Clean punching is the act of landing a solid, forceful punch on a legal scoring area using good technique, the force of one's own body weight, and the leverage created by the physics of how you position your body. A clean punch is made with good technique, not because it's aesthetically pleasing or it looks cool, but because a clean punch has the proper technique behind it. When we think about proper technique, I want you to think of the terms form and power. I studied Taekwondo for years and used to teach it, and the style of Taekwondo I was involved in was called Chung Do Kwan, which was translated as form and power, and one derives from the other. You get your best power from having the proper form, and you get the best form when you're powerful. Effective aggressiveness is also about damage. It's about aggressiveness that leads to putting some harm onto your opponent. So it's activity that leads to damage. It involves things like we hear the announcers talk about, things like pushing the action, moving forward. Sometimes we hear the term imposing one's will. But all of those things are only point scoring when they're centered around doing damage or leading to doing damage. This is pro boxing, and what we're looking for is putting something on one's opponent. Now, I want you to think about some other things. What other things are effective in terms of aggressiveness, and what are signs when a fighter is being aggressive in the ring? Think about fighters like perhaps Vinny Paz, and how Vinny would get excited, hit himself in the head, make a lot of noise, and move around. Is that effective aggressiveness? It looks aggressive, but is there anything effective about it? Probably not. The same fighter, Vinny Paz, when he would move forward and he would throw a bunch of punches, some landing on arms, but some scoring, was very much indeed being effective with his aggressiveness. So when a fighter is getting charged up and psyching himself up, there's nothing there to score. It's what he or she does subsequent to getting riled up like that. When a fighter continually moves forward, is that a sign of effective aggressiveness? Well, if it leads to scoring blows. If a fighter moves forward and then gets tagged on the way in, then that isn't very effective, is it? So you need to really think about effectiveness. And effectiveness is centered around, is it doing damage or leading to damage? Okay, ring generalship. These are the things that a fighter does to control the action, and once again, they all lead to doing damage. Good footwork. If you think of a classic fighter like Willie Pep, or in more modern eras, Pernell Whitaker or Hector Camacho, they had great footwork, and that footwork put them in position to land punches and do damage. You see somebody today like Zab Judah, who has terrific footwork, and it enables him to score punches where he might not be able to if he didn't have such good footwork. Other signs of ring generalship might involve good inside work. When you watch a fighter get inside, be able to pivot or move slightly, and then be able to land punches to the body, that kind of inside work is sophisticated. It's not just all brawn. And that's, in a way, being a ring general. It's just being a ring general in tight. And you see fighters turn their opponents, where they get in tight and they spin the opponent around. That puts the opponent at a disadvantage. And it, for the one doing the spinning, gives them a greater chance to score a punch there. And cutting off the ring is one of the classic things we often hear about. And when we talk about cutting off the ring, that's usually a stalking behavior. The ring general who is cutting off the ring is setting himself up to land some punches. But once again, these all must lead to damage to really be influential in terms of scoring, and when we go into scoring around. If a fighter is doing these things with no subsequent clean punches and no aggressiveness, then what have they really done? So we have to look at effective aggressiveness, but especially clean punching as our main criteria. The other ones are there to support that criteria. Defense. Can we win a round just on defense? Well, I suppose in theory we could, but in essence, defense is protecting yourself from the damage the opponent is trying to inflict upon you. And the best type of defense is the defense that keeps the fighter on the defensive in position to do his own damage. So a fighter who can block, not get hit, but not give ground and be in a position to counter is employing the best type of defense in terms of points. A good defense that sets up the potential for offense and for doing damage is the best type of defense. So when we see a fighter who can block or evade without giving ground, that points us to a fighter who's getting ready to do damage. A fighter who moves backwards or even side to side, but without allowing themselves to stay in position, isn't being effective with their defense. What are some of the other things that involve good defense? Well, part of good defense is having a good offense and being busy enough to keep your opponent away from you. Effective blocks, keeping your guard up and your hands in good position, or even one's shoulder. We see a fighter like Floyd Mayweather, Adrian Broner, or James Toney, and by keeping their trapezius muscle up high, it deflects any punch that might land on their head would be caught by their shoulder. And these are all effective defensive techniques. The best defensive techniques, in summary, keep the fighter capable of doing their own damage and staying offensive. So when we look at our scoring criteria, this training is about finding a way to answer the scoring questions that are on our mind. So when we break down the behavior, the things that a fighter is doing throughout each round, I want us to be able to have components and to our scoring and have clear answers to why we score around the way we do. And we might look at scoring criteria and say, well, this is easy enough. Let's look who's doing more damage. Well, maybe. But what happens when we have several things going on at once in a fight? How many jabs equal one power shot or one cross? And how many hard jabs versus how many light jabs? What about body shots that a boxer is ignoring? And how do we score a series of body shots that land but don't do much damage? What about aggression that doesn't do anything? What about a fighter who gets revved up and throws punches into the arms and punches that are blocked and that don't land in the scoring area? How do we gauge that? And how do we gauge that against an opponent who is doing very little at all? What about a light jab that lands? What about sloppy punches that land? These are the things that go on all the time in boxing in terms of scoring rounds and things that we face in real life. Now let's take a look at some of the terms we use. We talk about things like dominance, clean punches, harder punches, combinations, pushing the action, inside work, all things we might even jot down on a score sheet. Okay, but can we go even further? Can we go a step further and be specific what those terms mean in real practice with a real fighter? When we talk about a fighter being dominant, what does that mean? When we talk about a fighter pushing the action, what does that mean? Well, let's take a look at something Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart once said. I shall not today attempt further to define the kinds of materials I understand to be embraced within this shorthand description, and perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so. But I know it when I see it, and the motion picture involved in this case is not that. Now, Justice Stewart was talking about what makes a movie pornographic and what makes a movie artistic. We're not talking about porn here in our training, but a lot of what Justice Stewart said applies to when we evaluate a round. And what I want you to do is I want you to think a little bit about how we know somebody won a round and what builds up to that. And a lot of it falls into the category, just like Justice Stewart said, of knowing it when we see it. What I want you to be able to do after this training is not only know it when you see it, but be able to expressly state what it is you saw and what in those techniques, those exchanges, made you believe one fighter won the round over another. So what I challenge you to be able to do in this training is to be more specific with the terms that we use and put them in, when we put them into practice. Now, part of what we do is we look at things like efficiency. And without trying to get too intellectual on you here, the idea of our body mechanics. There is a ideal way to throw a punch. There's probably more than one, but there's a reason why punches in good form count more than poorly thrown punches. Because a poorly thrown punch isn't as efficient with the body mechanics, and therefore it doesn't have as much force behind it. Now, of course, you can throw a really unfundamental, lousy punch that could knock somebody out. But all things being equal, a punch with good form, with the proper body mechanics behind the punch, will be worth more than a sloppy punch thrown the same way. So part of this training is to break down and look at our punches. And there really only are 4 punches. There's the jab, the cross, the hook, and the uppercut. And some might argue that there's modifications of these and variations of these, but probably there are only 4 punches. And why are there just 4 punches? Why isn't it like karate where there's hundreds of strikes? Well, the reason there's 4 punches is because inside the rules of boxing, there really only are 4 fundamental ways to efficiently throw a punch, with slight variation, of course. Okay, when we talk about the jab, we know what a jab is. We know what a jab looks like. The jab comes off the shoulder. There's very little shift in stance compared to the other punches, and it is thrown as a punch that leads into other punches. It doesn't cover a lot of ground, but it sets up the other punches. It can be used as a distraction, can be used as a defensive punch. It is a tool to keep the other fighter from moving in. It can be thrown in multiples. It can set up the cross, and it is it's a punch that is often reliant on speed as much as it is power. The cross comes from the rear hand, and this is the power punch. The rear hand, the rear hand crosses the body, the shoulders rotate towards the target, and the hips and the legs and the torso are all involved in this punch, and that's where the power comes from. When we look at the power of a punch, the ability for a fighter to be able to master the mechanics of shifting of the body weight throughout the body has very, very much to do with the quality of the punch. If we look at a modern-day fighter like Gennady Golovkin, when you see him, he's not a real big or real muscular individual. But somehow, through mastering the shifting of his body weight, he is able to generate a ton of power. The hook punch, it comes off the front hand, and once again, it relies on the explosive rotation of the hips and the shoulders. And when the rotation of the hips and shoulders are combined with the shifting of body weight, a lot of power can be generated. It can be thrown horizontally, or it can be thrown with a bit of an angle to it. And as we've seen with a fighter like Oscar De La Hoya, who sometimes threw a punch that came from like a 45-degree angle, the hook can have lots of different variations. The uppercut, of course, is thrown upwards with either hand, although most fighters will use their rear hand as having more power when it comes to the uppercut. It travels vertically and often comes underneath the guard and lands on the chin. It can be a very powerful punch and often very effective for a southpaw fighter to land on a conventional fighter. So when we look at these 4 punches, it's really important to understand what makes each of them fundamentally sound. There's a video that I've posted on my YouTube page made by the people at Title Boxing, where they go over the fundamentals of each punch. And don't think for a second it's too simple for us to study such things. Because if you really understand the proper fundamentals of a punch, when we evaluate those punches in the ring, we can be much more effective and exact with assessing when a good punch is thrown. So know the fundamentals and take the time to watch the title video or any of a number of fundamental videos on the proper mechanics of a punch. And when you're judging a match, when you're judging a round, watch the fighter. Look where their feet are planted. Look how their body shifts. Look how their shoulders and their hips rotate. Poorly thrown punches are robbed of power. So when we analyze the specifics of a round and we're looking at a punch, we want to look at things like, very basically, did it land? And when it landed, was the wrist and arm in alignment? Were the feet planted in balance? Now, why are the feet so important? Well, if you don't have your feet underneath you and your body isn't balanced, it's a good chance that your arm didn't bring as much power as it potentially could have. Was the timing of the rest of the shifting of the body weight in sync? A perfectly thrown punch, it will be a thing of beauty, and it will flow. It won't be choppy. It will flow right from the toes up to the arm. And did the punch land with the scoring part of the glove? Sometimes we'll hear that certain fighters are slappers. And interesting enough, a slapping punch is often the punch that's loudest in the arena, that gives us the calls to our attention the most. And that's a mistake, because that slapping punch doesn't carry as much power as a punch that lands with the proper positioning of the hand. There's other important aspects when it comes to assessing who's winning a round. And when we analyze those specifics, they can really tell the tale about who's winning the round, particularly in rounds that are very close and when there isn't the obvious amount of damage being done by one fighter over the other. So take a look at things like who's willing to cross the neutral zone. Now, the neutral zone, if you have two boxers involved in a match, in order to land, one has to make themselves vulnerable to cross the neutral zone to throw a punch and land a punch. In order to land a punch, you have to get close enough to put yourself in danger. A fighter who is willing to cross the neutral zone is carrying the action. So the willingness to cross the neutral zone will tell you who's imposing whose will to some extent. Another very clear determinant of making oneself able to land is the willingness to plant your feet and commit to your punch. Sometimes fighters will be busy. Sometimes fighters will throw a series of punches into their opponent's, let's say, lead flank, and then scurry out of the way. Well, how much do those punches really count if the boxer didn't plant his feet, didn't commit to the punch, and really drive the punch? So look for the fighter who will plant their feet solidly and commit the punch and follow it through. When you do that, you have to stay in position to get hit, again, making yourself vulnerable. So the fighter who's willing to plant their feet and really commit to their punches throws more damaging punches. If we look at fighters throughout the years who have been considered boxers, very good boxers, folks like Hector Camacho or Pernell Whitaker, they're at their best when the quick jabs they throw have planted feet and planted body weight behind them. When they're just flipping and moving, there really isn't that much to score there because those punches don't have the force to cause damage. So the idea of committing your body, committing yourself to the punch, means making yourself available for danger. You're making yourself vulnerable. Defense, of course, is part of our criteria, but defense ought to be the type of defense that keeps the fighter in position and able to score. Defense that involves just scurrying away shouldn't be rewarded. Defense that is effective in evasion but also keeps the fighter in position to score is the best type of defense. And throughout this, think of the other things that make up a boxing match. It's like a gigantic Rubik's Cube. about all the different variables that go into the idea of imposing one's will or standing one's ground, and the idea of making oneself vulnerable while seeking to do damage is the key thing. So pay attention to all the different factors and the body mechanics that go into things like crossing the neutral zone, committing to a punch, committing to your body weight and your body position. Those are the things that will tip you as a judge to who's imposing their will, who's carrying the fight, and who's being effectively aggressive. Now, when we look at our profession, the things that make boxing difficult to judge involve equations. And when we look at things like which one fighter throwing more powerful punches versus a fighter who's throwing more punches, that presents a challenge to us. There's also the equation of how do we calculate a score when neither fighter is involved in much activity. When there's a lack of activity, often those are the most challenging rounds to score. What if there's a lot of activity and a lot of damage on both sides? Then those rounds have a lot of variables going on, a lot of action, and that makes it tough on our own mental computers to come up with a score. Another equation that makes it difficult to come up with a score sometimes can be a wide difference in the styles of the fighters. So if you have a wide swinging fighter who doesn't practice the fundamentals but lands with some strange punches, and he's in battle or she's in battle against somebody who's very tight and very fundamental, how do we judge the sloppy punches, particularly if more sloppy punches are landed versus tight, good, solid punches? When we look at brawlers versus slick boxers, sometimes there's a lot of variables to calculate and to keep straight in our head when we come up with our score at the end of the round. And think for yourself all the different variables that can go in to making a round difficult to score. Because when we're aware of those things, then we can be prepared to deal with them as they come up. Some of our tough rounds to score, in addition, will be rounds where there's not a lot of action. The rounds where there's a jabber facing the heavy hitter. How do we calculate and how do we form an opinion and a score on the fighter who scores backing up? So they're giving ground. Maybe their weight is even going backwards, yet they're landing punches. We have to somehow evaluate the fighter who's going forward and pressing the action and the fighter who's going backwards, which would usually mean that they're giving ground and giving up a round. But if they're scoring going back rounds, those are legitimate scoring points. It can be a difficult round to add up. One of the rounds that I find most challenging is the busy but not very damaging fighter against a fighter who lands one big shot in a round. So if one big shot is landed and it does enough, if in your evaluation it does more damage than a lot of pitter-pats, do you give that round to the one big shot? Sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. How do we measure and how do we calculate the ineffective aggressor? The fighter who's huffing and puffing and maybe even hitting his own head and moving and making a lot of gyrations and flexing a lot of muscle, but not landing a lot of punches. Is that worth anything? And is that worth anything if the opponent is inactive? There's a note here that I refer to as the sparring round. Have you ever judged a round where the two fighters are active, they're busy, but it's almost like a round you would watch in a gym where fighters are practicing to get sharp. They're landing punches against each other, but they're not committing a lot of power to them. They're sparring. They're exchanging. They're not doing a lot of damage. Sometimes you'll see this in journeyman fighters when you have maybe an 8-round fighter with two fighters who have 25 or more fights, and they know how not to get hurt, and they know how to look good, but maybe they're not committed to winning. And those sparring rounds can be difficult to judge. And as always, keeping a calculation of the quality of punches and the quantity of punches. That may be our biggest challenge, is how do we measure big shots versus a lot of shots? You've heard the adage, I'm sure, over and over and over, that styles make fights. They also affect the scoring of a fight. We have to know how to apply our criteria and our 4 aspects of that criteria in a systematic way. We know fights are divided into rounds, but a lot of things can happen in the 180 seconds that go into a round. So we don't want to look at, in our heads, in our mental computer, a 3-minute interaction. We want to look at every interaction that goes on. We want to look at every event, every micro event that involves the 4 criteria, and keep a running score while that's going on. Our job, a judge's job, is to evaluate these micro events as they occur and determine over the 3-minute period which fighter causes the most damage. So we have to keep an idea of what's going on at all times and evaluate each thing that happens throughout the 180 seconds in the round. Okay, let's start putting some of this stuff into practice. And I've put together a series of videotapes that I hope illustrate the different variables that I've been talking about. And I took a series of fighters from the 80s and 90s, mostly because they had different styles and because they faced each other, kind of a 6 degrees of separation from each fighter, so that we can look at the different variables that each fighter brings, what they do when they're effective and what they fail to do when they're ineffective. And by looking at this, we can start to apply some of these principles that I've been talking about. And it's a good way to illustrate the different styles, the different factors that fighters bring, and on what circumstances those techniques that they use, why they work sometimes and why they don't work on other times. The fighters I selected: Hector Camacho Sr., known for his speed, his defense, and also his suspect power, particularly as he went up in weight. Sometimes criticized for being over-defensive, sometimes criticized for not training and being overly flamboyant. Had a ton of fights, and one of my personal favorites. And I was deeply saddened when we lost him. One of his famous opponents and one of his famous losses was Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., a dominant fighter during his reign. He was willing to walk in, cross that neutral zone, sometimes take 3 punches to land 1, but he had devastating power. He would work the body, he would cross the neutral zone, he would make himself vulnerable. He kept moving forward at all times, which sometimes was his downfall. And we can look at when. Greg Haugen. Greg Haugen was often seen as kind of a lunch pail, unsophisticated fighter. He was tough, he was persistent, but not without boxing skills. He came to fight, he was tough. Sometimes his toughness got him in trouble. And he was effective, oftentimes with slick boxers. He was certainly effective at times against Hector Camacho, but not effective against Pernell Whitaker. And we will kind of look at what was the difference in those 2 fights. Pernell Whitaker, great boxer, lots of speed, lots of defense. Was also criticized for not having a ton of power. One thing when we look at Pernell Whitaker, and left-hander, crafty boxer, almost the same type of fighter as Hector Camacho, except when it came to employing his defense, Pernell Whitaker was better at standing his ground, particularly late in both of their careers. Whitaker could be defensive while still keeping himself in position and in range to be offensive. Meldrick Taylor. In some ways, you looked at a fighter who was the entire package in his prime. Speed, power, and maybe a ton of heart, maybe too much heart for his own good. And we'll look at how he performed against Julio Cesar Chavez in a very close fight, which, of course, had the controversial ending. But some rounds Taylor was dominant, and some rounds he lost. And we'll look at what the case was in those bouts that made him effective and ineffective. Oscar De La Hoya, the golden boy, who was the shining star of our sport for a good long period. A straight-up fighter. He had a lot of power in his hook. He was fast, but he was also sometimes rigid. And we'll look at fights in which he was effective with what he was doing, and in fights where maybe if he was less rigid, he could have performed better. Felix Trinidad, in many ways, very similar to Oscar De La Hoya. Both straight up, both powerful, both came forward. Felix Trinidad's defense and his penchant for coming straight forward got him in trouble late in his career. And so the same thing that brought him success in some ways was his downfall, particularly as he got older. And so when we look at these bouts, we're going to look at the variables within our scoring criteria and all the things that add up to damage being done and how we evaluate that. And these fighters and their different styles will be ideal ways to put into practice some of the things we've been discussing. So let's look at Camacho versus Haugen. When Camacho's at his best, what does he do? Well, it's pretty simple. He commits to the jab. He doesn't just flick out. He commits it. He stands his ground, and he's willing to cross that neutral zone and land that jab. His punches have his body weight solidly behind them. They're not just arm punches. And his movement, his wonderful movement, is there with purpose. And that purpose is to keep him in position to cause damage. It isn't just merely to evade. When he loses a round, what does he do? Well, his jab flicks out without the intent of causing any damage. It's just a wayfinder. It's just something to be busy. He throws his punches while he's on his toes with the commitment not to do damage, but the commitment to stay away from damage and to move. So his weight is, when he's already kind of punched his ticket to get out of the way, he's not in position to do damage. And his movement, as beautiful it is to watch, is when it's focused on escape, he doesn't put himself in the position to do damage and doesn't score points that way. How about Haugen? What does he do? Well, if you study him closely, it's interesting because what he does when he's effective is he's willing to cross the neutral zone and continue on even if Camacho lands a jab. So Haugen needs to maybe eat one or two to land his damaging punches. When he goes through the neutral zone and gets caught and stops, he's in big trouble. He's at his best when he's moving forward, and he's at his best when he throws punches and bunches, as the announcers like to say. He's not a one-punch knockout artist. He's not a slick boxer. He's a fighter that has to mug his opponent. So he's at his best when he throws a number of punches. And he does really well when he cuts off the ring and then throws his punches in bunches. He doesn't do so well when he starts to go through the neutral zone, gets caught, and freezes. Then he's a sitting duck for Camacho's speed. When he follows Camacho around the ring but doesn't cut Camacho off, he becomes a slave to Camacho's movement and is ineffective. And when he throws single punches and allows himself to be countered by Camacho's speed, he isn't effective. What does Chavez do when he's effective? What we see with Julio is that when he continues to move forward and gets his punches off, even when he's hit, he puts himself in a position to do damage. It's when he stops or doesn't commit through the neutral zone that he gets in trouble. He's at his best when he finishes the exchanges he gets involved in. Because of his durability, he could trade punches, but if he fails to punctuate those exchanges, he comes away not winning them. He's at his best, much like Greg Haugen, when he's effectively cutting off the ring. And he's at his best when he goes to the body, punishes the body, and then varies it by coming up to his opponent's head. He's not at his best when he gets countered coming in and doesn't follow up and make his opponent pay. So when he's brave enough to cross the neutral zone and he takes the punches coming in, he needs to counter those punches. He needs to continue on. If he comes forward, which he almost always does, and doesn't punch, he puts himself in a position to lose the round. When he follows without cutting off the ring and without getting off with his punches, he's not doing any damage. And when he engages Taylor, but he doesn't do enough to win the exchange, he puts himself in a position to lose the round. Taylor is at his best when he stands his ground and counters. When he plants his feet, receives Chavez's offense, but then counters with his feet planted. Those are effective punches. When he uses his hand speed by planting his feet and showing power, he's effective. When he counters but gets out of the way to avoid damage and Chavez's counters, he's in good shape. And when he moves with purpose. Sometimes fighters will move, but they won't be moving economically and will be moving not in a way that sets them up to do damage. He's losing the round or he's losing exchanges when he doesn't counter enough. When he just takes punches willingly or blocks punches but doesn't counter. As I mentioned before, sometimes he's too brave for his own good, and when he stands and takes shots, he's doing nothing to win the round. When he doesn't move enough, he puts himself in position to be dominated by Chavez. And when he forgets to be busy. There's rounds where a fighter may not be getting beaten up, but if they're not doing enough to win the round convincingly just by a lack of busyness, that's a mistake. Pernell Whitaker is at his best when he evades and uses his defense but stays in position, and that position allows him to do damage. He's at his best when he throws punches with his feet set and the body weight behind him. So when he throws a counter punch, there's some power to it. And when his movement leaves him in position to score. He's not in the best position to win a round when he evades without the purpose of scoring. So sure, there's some defense involved there, but not a lot to give him a lot of points for a round. He sometimes counters and lands a punch, but doesn't have a lot of power behind it. So sure, it's a scoring strike, but the lack of power has to be factored into it. When his feet aren't set, he robs himself of power. And when he isn't busy enough with power to offset his opponent's scoring. In other words, when Chavez roughs him up a bit and Whitaker may not feel like he's been punished a lot, he still needs to counter to accumulate points to win the round. Now, Oscar De La Hoya. When we see Oscar De La Hoya against Pernell Whitaker, we see him at his best when he continues to be busy and when he tries to remain fluid. When he's rigid and stiff and in some ways over-calculating, he seems to be susceptible to Whitaker's boxing skills. So De La Hoya is at his best when he lets his punches go, when he keeps his balance, and when he tries to cut Whittaker off as opposed to following him around the ring. Oscar is least effective when he follows without purpose, when he seems to overthink his punches and not let his hands go, and when he crosses the neutral zone and doesn't get out in time. If he gets into the neutral zone and isn't busy enough, he's susceptible to Whittaker's sneaky counters. He also needs to use his power and his strength to his advantage to force the action against Whittaker. What we don't see him do is what Chavez does when Chavez is at his best, and that is to move in, take a few punches to land some punches. And that's just a stylistic thing. So what we see Trinidad do is move forward and get off with both hands and to have a willingness to cross the neutral zone and to be effective. If there's a criticism that we could have against Felix Trinidad is that sometimes he crosses the neutral zone with abandonment. And we see this later on in his career against Winky Wright, where he had no answer for Wright's jab, but would continue to step in with the goal of executing his power, and Wright would make him pay. So in summing up, scoring professional boxing is about evaluating damage. It's about who put more hurt on the other. Everything else adds up to that. So when we look at the whole idea of judging, let's not make it any more complicated than it is. But let's make sure we know what does damage, what does inflict hurt, and what is effective and what is efficient. By studying things like the essence of a punch, the body mechanics, and the force the body can wield, we can be better at evaluating and ultimately better at scoring.